The documents that IBRAHIM Traoré spread across the desk contained classified information that had never seen the light of day. As he began reading from the first page, Candace felt her face flush with disbelief. The papers detailed secret agreements between American corporations and African governments, agreements that painted a very different picture of American involvement in Africa than what had been presented to the public. "This document here," Traoré said, pointing to a page with official State Department letterhead, "shows how American companies have been systematically extracting resources from African nations while providing minimal compensation to local populations." His voice remained calm, but the implications of his words were explosive. The document outlined specific deals involving major American corporations that Candace had previously praised for their international business success. Candace's mind raced as she tried to process what she was hearing. These weren't just accusations or conspiracy theories. These were official documents with government seals, signatures from high-ranking officials, and detailed financial breakdowns that showed exactly how much money had been involved in these deals. The numbers were staggering, and the percentages going to African nations were embarrassingly small compared to the profits being extracted. As Traoré continued reading, he revealed information about political interference that went far beyond what most Americans knew about their government's activities in Africa. He spoke about covert operations designed to influence elections, about economic pressure tactics used to force African leaders into unfavorable agreements, and about the systematic undermining of leaders who refuse to cooperate with American interests. "Your government has been telling you that America promotes democracy and freedom around the world," Traoré said, looking directly at Candace. "But these documents show a different story. They show deliberate efforts to keep African nations dependent and unable to develop their own independent economic systems." Candace found herself in an impossible position. As a conservative commentator, she had always defended American foreign policy and criticized those who claimed the United States was an imperialist power. But the evidence being presented before her eyes was undeniable. The documents weren't just random papers. They bore the signatures of officials she recognized, people she had interviewed and praised in the past. The studio audience, initially expecting a typical political debate, sat in stunned silence as Traoré methodically went through document after document. Each revelation was more damaging than the last, painting a picture of systematic exploitation that had been hidden from the American public for decades. The camera operators, uncertain whether they should continue filming, looked to their producers for guidance. Candace's phone began buzzing frantically in her earpiece. Her producers were clearly panicking, trying to figure out whether they should cut to commercial or continue with what was becoming one of the most explosive interviews in television history. She could hear urgent whispers from the control room, but she knew that cutting away now would only fuel speculation and make the situation worse. What made the situation even more challenging for Candace was that Traoré wasn't presenting himself as an enemy of America. He spoke respectfully about the American people, making clear distinctions between the actions of the government and the values that ordinary Americans believed in. This nuanced approach made it impossible for her to dismiss him as simply anti-American, which would have been her usual defensive strategy. As the second commercial break approached, Candace realized that her entire worldview was being challenged in real time on live television. The young African leader had come prepared with evidence that couldn't be easily dismissed or explained away, and she was beginning to understand that this interview would have consequences far beyond what she had ever imagined possible. The studio lights blazed down on the polished desk as Candace Owens adjusted her blazer, preparing for what she expected to be another routine political commentary show. The evening broadcast of Real Talk America had become her platform to discuss conservative viewpoints and challenge liberal narratives. Tonight's guest was someone she had only heard whispers about in political circles: IBRAHIM Traoré, the young military leader from Burkina Faso who had been making waves across Africa. Candace had done her research, or so she thought. Traoré was known for his anti-colonial stance and his criticism of Western interference in African affairs. She assumed this would be another opportunity to discuss African leadership and perhaps find common ground on issues of sovereignty and self-determination. What she didn't expect was the bombshell that was about to explode across live television. As the cameras rolled, Candace introduced her guest with her characteristic confidence. Tonight we have IBRAHIM Traoré, the leader who has been shaking up West Africa with his bold policies. Captain Traoré, thank you for joining us. She smiled, expecting the usual diplomatic pleasantries that often opened such interviews. Traoré, dressed in his military uniform, looked directly into the camera with an intensity that immediately caught the attention of viewers. His presence was commanding, and there was something in his eyes that suggested he had come with a specific purpose. Thank you for having me, Ms. Owens. I appreciate this platform because what I'm about to share needs to be heard by the American people. The first hint that this interview would be different came when Traoré began speaking about Africa's relationship with the United States. Instead of the expected discussion about trade partnerships or diplomatic relations, he started revealing details about secret meetings and behind-the-scenes negotiations that had never been made public. His voice was steady, but his words carried the weight of someone who had witnessed things that troubled him deeply. Candace felt her stomach tighten as she realized this wasn't going according to plan. The young African leader was speaking with the authority of someone who had access to information that most people, including herself, had never heard before. As he continued, she noticed the production team in the background becoming visibly agitated, whispering urgently among themselves. The American people deserve to know the truth about what their government has been doing in Africa, Traoré continued, his gaze unwavering. They deserve to know about the secret deals, the resource extraction agreements, and the political manipulations that have been happening behind closed doors. His accent carried the weight of conviction, and every word seemed carefully chosen for maximum impact. What happened next would change everything. Traoré reached into his jacket and pulled out a folder containing documents that he claimed would expose decades of hidden American foreign policy in Africa. The papers rustled as he opened the folder, and Candace could see official-looking seals and signatures on the documents. Her heart began racing as she realized she was about to become part of something much larger than a simple interview. The revelation that followed would not only shock Candace, but would also send ripples through the political establishment, challenging everything she thought she knew about American foreign policy and her own role in the conservative media landscape. As Traoré began reading from the documents, Candace's world was about to be turned upside down in ways she never could have imagined. When the interview resumed after the commercial break, IBRAHIM Traoré's demeanor shifted noticeably. He had established the broader context of American interference in Africa, but now his focus became more personal and direct. He looked straight at Candace with an expression that was both disappointed and determined, as if he had been waiting for this moment throughout the entire broadcast. Ms. Owens, he began, his voice carrying a weight that made everyone in the studio lean forward. I need to address something specific about your role in all of this. Candace felt her heart skip a beat. She had thought the revelations were about American foreign policy in general, but it was becoming clear that Traoré had done his homework about her specifically. He pulled out another document from his folder, this one bearing her name prominently at the top. You have been promoting certain narratives about Africa and African leaders that serve the interests of the same system I've been exposing tonight, he said, his tone measured but firm. This document shows your connections to organizations that have been actively working to undermine African independence movements. The document he displayed showed financial contributions and speaking fees that Candace had received from think tanks and organizations that, according to Traoré's evidence, were directly connected to the corporations exploiting African resources. The amounts were significant, and the timing of these payments corresponded with some of her most vocal criticisms of African leaders who had stood up to Western interference. Candace felt the blood drain from her face as she realized the implications of what was being revealed. She had always prided herself on her independence and integrity, believing that her conservative viewpoints came from genuine conviction rather than financial influence. But the evidence being presented suggested that she had unknowingly become part of a larger propaganda machine designed to justify American exploitation of Africa. I need you to understand, Traoré continued, That when you criticize leaders like Thomas Sankara or speak positively about certain military interventions, you are not just expressing political opinions. You are helping to shape public opinion in ways that directly harm African people. His words cut deep because they challenged not just her political positions, but her sense of moral purpose. The studio audience began to murmur as the personal nature of the confrontation became clear. This wasn't just about foreign policy anymore. It was about Candace's credibility and whether she had been manipulated by the very forces she claimed to oppose. The cameras captured every emotion crossing her face as she struggled to process the accusations and evidence being presented. What made the situation even more painful for Candace was that Traoré wasn't attacking her with anger or hostility. His tone remained respectful, almost sympathetic, as if he understood that she might have been as much a victim of manipulation as the African populations he was defending. This approach made it impossible for her to respond with her usual combative style. "I believe you are a sincere person who truly wants to do what's right," Traoré said, his voice softening slightly. "But I also believe you have been used by people who don't share your values. The question now is what you will do with this information." He paused, allowing his words to sink in before continuing. "Will you continue to promote narratives that harm my people, or will you use your platform to tell the truth?" Candace found herself speechless for one of the few times in her career. The evidence was overwhelming, the accusations were specific and documented, and the challenge was direct and personal. She could feel the eyes of millions of viewers upon her, waiting to see how she would respond to having her entire career and belief system called into question on live television. The weight of the moment was crushing. Everything she had built, every position she had taken, every relationship she had formed in conservative media was now being scrutinized through the lens of these revelations. The young African leader had not just exposed American foreign policy. He had exposed her role in perpetuating a system she thought she was fighting against. The moment of truth arrived when Candace finally tried to respond to IBRAHIM Traoré's revelations. Her voice, usually strong and confident, began to shake as she attempted to defend herself against the mounting evidence. I had no idea about these connections," she stammered, her hands visibly trembling as she gestured toward the documents spread across the desk. Traoré watched her with what appeared to be genuine sympathy, but he didn't let her off the hook. "Ms. Owens, ignorance is not an excuse when you have a platform that reaches millions of people. When you speak about Africa, when you defend certain policies, people listen to you. They trust you. And that trust has been used to perpetuate harm." The words hit Candace like physical blows. For years, she had built her career on being the voice of truth, the person who wasn't afraid to challenge narratives and expose hypocrisy. Now she was being confronted with evidence that she herself had been a tool of the very system she claimed to oppose. The irony was devastating, and the cameras captured every moment of her realization. "You want to know what hurts the most?" Traoré continued, his voice gentle but unwavering. "It's that people like you, who have the intelligence and the platform to make a real difference, have been convinced to work against their own stated values. You talk about freedom and independence, but you've been promoting policies that keep entire nations dependent and oppressed." Candace felt tears beginning to form in her eyes, something that had never happened during a broadcast in her entire career. The emotional weight of understanding how she had been manipulated, combined with the public nature of this revelation, was overwhelming. She had always prided herself on being strong, on never showing weakness, but this moment stripped away all her defenses. The studio fell into complete silence as viewers witnessed something unprecedented, one of the most confident voices in conservative media being reduced to tears on live television. The camera operators didn't know whether to focus on her face or look away out of respect for what was clearly a deeply personal moment of reckoning. "I built my entire career on telling the truth," Candace finally managed to say, her voice cracking with emotion. "I thought I was fighting against the establishment, against the lies and the manipulation, but you're telling me that I was part of it all along." The question hung in the air like a challenge to everything she thought she knew about herself. Traoré leaned forward slightly, his expression compassionate but firm. The truth is often painful, Ms. Owens, but it's also liberating. You have a choice now. You can continue down the same path, or you can use this moment to truly become the voice of truth you always wanted to be. But this time, you'll know who you're really serving. The emotional impact of the moment was amplified by the fact that millions of people were watching live. Social media was exploding with reactions as viewers tried to process what they were seeing. Some expressed sympathy for Candace, while others demanded accountability for the role she had played in spreading what Traoré was calling propaganda. What made the situation even more poignant was that Traoré wasn't gloating or celebrating her distress. Instead, he seemed genuinely concerned about the human cost of the system he was exposing. "This is not about destroying you as a person," he said quietly. "This is about breaking the chains that bind both Africa and America to a system that serves only a few at the expense of many." As the cameras continued to roll, Candace struggled to regain her composure, knowing that this moment would define not just the rest of the interview, but potentially the rest of her career. The young African leader had succeeded in doing something that no political opponent had ever managed. He had made her question everything she thought she knew about herself and her place in the world. Behind the scenes, panic was spreading through the television network and beyond as news of the explosive interview began circulating. Phone calls were flooding into the network's offices from powerful people who had never called before, demanding that the broadcast be cut short or that certain segments be edited out before any replays were aired. The network executives found themselves caught between their journalistic obligations and pressure from influential advertisers and political figures. IBRAHIM Traoré seemed aware of the chaos he was creating, and rather than backing down, he intensified his revelations. "I know there are people making phone calls right now," he said, looking directly into the camera, trying to shut down this conversation. That reaction alone should tell the American people everything they need to know about the truth of what I'm sharing. Meanwhile, Candace's phone had been vibrating nonstop with messages from colleagues, mentors, and media figures throughout the conservative establishment. Some were offering support, but many were demanding explanations and expressing concern about the damage this interview might do to the broader conservative movement. The pressure was immense, and she could feel the weight of an entire industry's expectations pressing down on her shoulders. The network's legal team had gathered in an emergency meeting, trying to determine whether any of the documents Traoré was displaying could expose them to lawsuits or whether continuing to broadcast might violate any regulations. The corporate sponsors were already threatening to pull their advertisements, worried about being associated with such controversial content. Traoré, observing the obvious tension in the studio, addressed it directly. "Ms. Owens, I can see you're receiving pressure from your colleagues and superiors. This is exactly how the system maintains itself. Through fear, through economic pressure, through the threat of professional isolation. The question is whether you'll allow that pressure to silence the truth." Social media platforms were struggling to keep up with the volume of content being shared about the interview. Hashtags related to the broadcast were trending worldwide within minutes, and the clips being shared were already reaching millions of viewers beyond those watching the live broadcast. The interview was becoming a global phenomenon in real time. Conservative media figures across the country were scrambling to respond to the revelations. Some were preparing to defend Candace and dismiss Traoré's claims as anti-American propaganda, while others were quietly distancing themselves, worried about being caught up in the scandal. The unity that typically characterized conservative media during crisis moments was notably absent. International news outlets were picking up the story, with African media in particular celebrating what they saw as a powerful moment of truth-telling on American television. European broadcasters were preparing special reports about the implications of Traoré's revelations for Western foreign policy, while Asian networks were analyzing how this might affect global power dynamics. The financial markets were even beginning to react, with stocks of some of the corporations mentioned in Traoré's documents starting to decline, as investors worried about potential investigations and public backlash. The interview was proving to have consequences far beyond the world of media and politics. As the broadcast continued, it became clear that this wasn't just a television interview anymore. It was a historic moment that was reshaping conversations about American foreign policy, media integrity, and the relationship between corporate interests and public opinion. The ripple effects were spreading faster than anyone could have anticipated. Candace found herself at the center of a storm that was much larger than herself, realizing that her response to this moment would not only determine her own future but could potentially influence how millions of Americans understood their country's role in the world. The weight of that responsibility was almost unbearable, especially given her emotional state and the continuing pressure from all sides. In the final moments of the interview, Candace Owens made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. With tears still visible in her eyes but her voice growing stronger, she looked directly at IBRAHIM Traoré and then turned to face the camera. "I need to apologize," she said, her words carrying a weight that silenced the entire studio. "To the African people who may have been harmed by narratives I've promoted without fully understanding their consequences." Traoré nodded respectfully, seemingly moved by her acknowledgement. "Apologies are important," he replied. "But what matters most now is what happens next. Will you use your platform to tell the complete truth, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it challenges the people who have supported your career?" The interview ended with Candace making an unprecedented commitment on live television. She promised to independently investigate the documents and connections that had been revealed, to bring in experts who could verify the information, and to dedicate future shows to exploring the full extent of American involvement in Africa. It was a promise that would fundamentally change the direction of her career. The immediate aftermath was chaotic. Within hours of the broadcast ending, Candace's social media accounts were flooded with reactions ranging from supportive messages, praising her honesty, to harsh criticism from former allies who accused her of betraying conservative principles. The conservative media establishment was split, with some figures rushing to defend the broader movement while others questioned whether deeper examination of these issues was needed. Traoré, meanwhile, had achieved something remarkable. He had successfully used American media to broadcast his message to a global audience, and the documents he had presented were being analyzed by journalists and investigators around the world. Several major news organizations announced they would be launching their own investigations based on the information he had revealed. The network executives faced a difficult decision about whether to continue supporting Candace after such a controversial broadcast. Advertisers were pulling out, but viewer ratings had skyrocketed, and international acclaim was pouring in for what many were calling brave journalism. The financial and reputational calculations were complex and unprecedented. 3 months later, Candace's show had transformed completely. She had hired African consultants and policy experts, began featuring voices that had never appeared on conservative media before, and started investigating corporate influence in ways that made many of her former allies uncomfortable. Her audience had changed too. She had lost some conservative viewers but gained a more diverse international following. The documents that Traoré had presented were eventually verified by multiple independent sources, leading to congressional hearings and international investigations. Several of the corporations mentioned faced significant legal and financial consequences, while some government officials were forced to testify about their roles in the policies that had been exposed. IBRAHIM Traoré's appearance on American television had achieved its intended effect. The conversation about American foreign policy in Africa had fundamentally shifted, with mainstream media outlets now regularly featuring African voices and perspectives that had previously been marginalized. The young leader had proven that sometimes the most powerful weapon against systemic oppression is simply the truth, presented at the right moment and in the right forum. For Candace, the interview represented both an ending and a beginning. Her old career as a predictable conservative commentator was over, but she had discovered a new purpose in genuine investigative journalism that prioritized truth over political convenience. The transformation was painful but ultimately liberating, allowing her to become the authentic voice she had always claimed to be. The ripple effects of that single evening continued to spread for years, changing careers, exposing corruption, and shifting public understanding of complex global relationships. It proved that sometimes the most important moments in history happen not in government buildings or corporate boardrooms, but in television studios where truth confronts power in real time.